Hi everyone, this video covers Descartes' fourth meditation, and I will leave a link to the version that I'm using down below. In the third meditation, Descartes has proven the existence of God, at least he thinks he has, so now he's going to proceed to fill out the rest of his world with the things that he knows. But first he wants to explain the difference between truth and error, or at least explain how it is possible, given that a perfect God exists, that he could ever find himself in error, he being Descartes. He says, "And now I seem to discover a path that will conduct us from the contemplation of the true God, in whom are contained all the treasures of science and wisdom, to the knowledge of the other things in the universe." He continues, "I discover that it is impossible for him ever to deceive me, because he is perfect, he is good and perfect." He continues, "Since it is impossible that he should will to deceive me, it is likewise certain that he has not given me a faculty that will ever lead me into error, provided that I use it aright." So he wants to explain now what it is, how he's been created by this perfect being, and how these faculties could, in fact, go wrong or make mistakes. He says, "Obviously, I am subject to innumerable errors, and yet there is a perfect God." He says, "I am, as it were, a mean between God and nothing, or placed in such a way between absolute existence and non-existence." So here you get this picture of the medieval worldview, where you have this great chain of being. God is in his heavens, and the creation is both separate and below him, and it descends in this hierarchy down through creation, the animals, the fish, and down into the realms of hell, where the devils, the demons, exist. He says he places himself somewhere in that hierarchy between existence and non-existence. He's not perfect like his creator. He says he participates, he says, in some degree of nothing. He says that he also includes the word non-being and defect. He also uses the word privation and want. So while he's not nothing, he's not absolutely non-existent, or in the medieval sense evil, he has goodness within him as a human, as a creation of God. He nevertheless has some privation or defects within him as well. He says, though, "There is no doubt that God could have created me such as that I could never be deceived." So he's curious why God might have created him so that he does make mistakes. Now he says he doesn't necessarily comprehend why God acts as he does, and he doesn't think that the fact that Descartes makes mistakes, that this means God doesn't exist, or that would be some reason or evidence for thinking that God doesn't exist. So now he moves into the richest part of the fourth meditation, where he talks about his mental faculties. And so he distinguishes between the faculty of cognition and the power of free choice. He says, "Whereupon, regarding myself more closely and considering what my errors are, which alone testify to the existence of imperfection in me, I observe that these depend on the concurrence of two causes, namely, the faculty of cognition, which I possess, and that of election, or the power of free choice. In other words, the understanding and the will." So he continues, "If I consider the faculty of this understanding which I possess, I find that it is of very small extent and greatly limited." So he recognizes that his intellect is finite. It's not like God knowing everything, and yet that's how God created him, and there's nothing imperfect about that. It's just limited because Descartes is a finite creature. He says, "If I examine the faculty of memory or imagination, or any other faculty I possess, I find none that is not small." So all of these faculties that he surveys are finite and not great like infinite God would have, and yet he finds no imperfection in them. He then says, "It is the faculty of will only, or freedom of choice, which I experience to be so great that I am unable to conceive the idea of another that shall be more ample and extended. So the difference between these faculties of understanding or intellect and the faculty of the will is that the former are all finite and limited, but the faculty of will is not limited in any way. He even compares it to God's will itself, because the will is not like, doesn't come in degrees as like lesser or more than. The will is either you've got it or you don't have it. You can will everything or you can will nothing. He says the power of will consists only in this, that we are able to do or not to do the same thing, that is, to affirm or deny, to pursue or shun it. Or rather, in this alone, that in affirming or denying, pursuing or shunning what is proposed to us by the understanding. He says, whence then springs my errors? They arise from this cause alone, that I do not restrain the will, which is of much wider range than the understanding, within the same limits, but extend it even to things I do not understand. And as the will is of itself indifferent to such, it readily falls into error and sin by choosing the false in room of the true, and evil instead of good. So he's saying it's not God's fault that I make mistakes. It's my fault. God has gifted me with this will. The trouble is how I use this will. He's gifted me with my intellect, though it is a finite intellect. The trouble is the will and its choice to affirm things that I am not certain about. So in other words, I rush ahead, I affirm things that I'm not absolutely certain of, or I deny things before I'm absolutely certain that they should be denied. So he considers some concerns here, some reasons he might complain. These are kind of like objections. He says, first, I have no reason to complain that God has not given me a greater power of intelligence or more perfect natural light than he has actually bestowed. In other words, I can't complain that I'm a finite creature. God created me as a finite creature, and he's given me a finite understanding, and that's okay. The second reason that he can't complain is that he can't complain that God has given him a will that's greater than his understanding, because wills only come in one sort. He couldn't have given him a weaker will, because there's no such thing as a weaker will. Again, his description of a will is that it's either you've got it or you don't. You can't have a weaker or stronger one. Also, he says, I ought not also to complain that God concurs with me in forming the acts of this will. So we can't complain. We can't say that God makes us do these things or choose error. Instead, God gives us our free will, which we freely use to get ourselves into trouble. And so we can't complain about that. We also can't complain that God could have made the world a better place, that if he were really a good God, he wouldn't have allowed us to fall into error. He says, I cannot therefore deny that it is not somehow a greater perfection in the universe, that certain of its parts are not exempt from defect. So in other words, kind of a skeptical argument that says, I don't know God's mind, I don't know the whole picture. It's possible that this is the best world where I make errors, and there are greater goods that come out of my making mistakes that I just don't understand. Finally, he says, to wrap things up, for as often as I so restrain my will within the limits of my knowledge, that it forms no judgment except regarding objects which are clearly and distinctly represented to it by the understanding, I can never be deceived, because every clear and distinct conception is doubtless something, and as such cannot owe its origin to nothing, but must of necessity have God for its author. God, I say, who, as supremely perfect, cannot, without contradiction, be the cause of any error. So as long as I choose, so you see, you've got these two faculties, the intellect and the will, and knowledge or understanding isn't simply a passive process, it's an active one. The intellect is passive, but it involves the will. It requires the will to come in to assent to things, and that's where things go wrong. When I assent to things that I'm not absolutely certain of, that's a mistake. Or when I deny things I'm not absolutely certain of, I also make the mistake. So Descartes thinks that we should control our wills better, and that would prevent us from falling into error. I hope you found that helpful.